Director of the MetroTech Business Improvement District in Brooklyn and founding Executive Director of New York Cares, a nonprofit volunteer agency. I ask you to please give a warm Chamber of Commerce welcome to Kenneth Adams. Ken.
Thank you, Ward. Good morning, everyone. Senator Bonasek reminded me, just urged me not tell him, Ken, you're still one of us, which I am. I'm still a chamber guy. You can't be a chamber guy and a chamber person and not continue. Now, I do make a comparison because, yeah, for what, I don't know, 10, 11 years we did I did chamber events in Brooklyn, not unlike this, except that this is a much more, well, how do I say this? And I'm sure that Brooklynites in the audience, much more well-behaved and disciplined crowd. Because when we would do the introduce the new members get to, the board, as you did a couple of moments ago, new members stand up and introduce themselves. I always had, at the end of all the new members, they get up, they're kind of nervous, they talk about their business. I noticed you didn't do that here, you just do the business. But they get up, they introduce themselves, and you go through a series of those, and people are really welcoming and they feel good. Because, by the way, growth in membership signals a growing local economy, we always say. It's a great metaphor, the chamber's health and prosperity for the community's prosperity. But inevitably in Brooklyn, in the back of the room, some guy gets up who had been in the chamber for like 30 years, pretending to be a new member and introducing himself to the new members. And they'd always do it from way in the back so that I would watch in horror. And then another one would stand up. Hi, I'm Phil with the insurance. You've been with the insurance 30 years. But they'd always pretend to be the new member so they could, you gotta make the commercial. You gotta get up, you gotta promote yourself. Very well-behaved crowd here. So far. So thanks, Ward, for the introduction. I want to try to cover three things, and then maybe, because I heard about the slideshow that I missed, a fourth, which is to talk a little bit about what we're trying to do to help businesses that have really suffered because of the devastating flooding here in Ulster County and around the state. And so that sort of comes at the end if we have time. And Ward, I don't know if the format will ask for some Q&A, but I'm always welcome to that if you are. But the three basic topics go like this. I want to do a quick review because a lot has happened, at least for me, in the last few months. I started, as Ward mentioned, just a few months ago, I guess 4 or 5 months ago, in spring. Governor Cuomo started obviously in January, and there's been a lot going on, and a lot has happened, especially in the world of economic development in New York State. So I do want to start with a review of the Cuomo administration's work to date on improving the state's business climate and improving our economic development, our economic competitiveness, because that's an important theme that certainly undergives much of your advocacy work at the Chamber, but it's very important for our broader economic development work at ESD. And number two, I do want to talk briefly about this new system of regional councils. I have to do that because it's so critical to the economic development programming and infrastructure of the state, but also because we've got Amy Vargas here. And you all need to know Amy. If you don't, I suspect many of you do know Amy. But apart from being our Mid-Hudson Regional Director of Empire State Development, so an important colleague of mine, Amy also is the Executive Director of the new Regional Council that the governor has formed for this area. And so you've probably read about her meetings and the council members. But I want to touch on that, not just for this area, but more broadly, some of the fundamentals of this new system based on the regional councils. And finally, the third thing I want to touch on is just some priorities that are vital for our ongoing work at ESD. Some of the things that we're doing that are maybe a little new and different, things we care about in our ongoing efforts at Empire State Development. So, and again, time permitting, let's talk a little bit about what we can do to help businesses that have been affected by the flooding. We got to go back, it isn't very long ago. I think it's 35 weeks or something like that, but only, you could count just a little over 8 months ago, as Governor Cuomo took office, let's remember where we were as a state. And I would argue, and I don't think it's overly dramatic, that we really, from an economic standpoint, we're in a downward spiral, frankly, like so many states around the nation at the time, suffering under the weight of a deep national recession. Recovery from that recession so hard and so difficult for the whole country and very difficult for New York, of course. And at the time, we lacked a practical sustainable plan for economic recovery in New York State. Again, that's where we started. But I'd argue that since that time, we really have taken great strides to change the direction in which New York was headed, beginning with one of the most extraordinary legislative sessions in Albany's history. Folks like Ward and others and Senator Bonisic, to be sure, who know Albany history, recognize that the 6 months of this session from January through June really were extraordinary, and all the achievements that the governor, working with the legislature, was able to produce for New Yorkers. Again, in this, remember the economic context that surrounds all this, the very challenging economic circumstances that we face. So that after this, the legislative session was remarkable, and through it, again, it's my view that the governor has begun to usher in a new dynamic to state government, and certainly in the delivery of services through the state agencies of the executive branch. It's built on the principles, very important. We had a cabinet meeting in Albany with the governor yesterday. Every cabinet meeting, the same principles come up: performance and integrity, and delivering results, practical results for New Yorkers all across the state. It's very focused, it's quite intense, and it's based on those principles. So the first phase of the governor's plan began during that legislative session, and it laid the groundwork for the economic development strategies that we're rolling out now. So these things are interconnected. Again, go back in time with me a little bit to earlier this year, and remember the first 90 days in Albany life, really January, the first quarter of our business year for most people, for many businesses, it is the last quarter of the state's fiscal year, right? So the state's fiscal year starts April 1st. So that first quarter is all about getting the budget done, and getting it done on time, and having it make sense. And this year, again, working with his partners in the legislature, Governor Cuomo delivered, as he had promised, a budget that was on time, but most notably reduced a $10 billion deficit. Eliminated a $10 billion deficit. The budget's about $123 billion. So this was a huge amount of money that just wasn't there, that had to be accommodated. By not raising new taxes and not doing any Albany gimmicks or borrowing or tricks. And this was really a significant feat. It was done, again, by the end of March, and by early April, some of us, I think people had forgotten about it, but fundamentally really important to the economy, in large measure because we had, in my view, it was no time to raise taxes in New York State, given the recession and given our economic position compared to other states. But also the act of fiscal discipline sends a message to you and to others in the business community that Albany gets it, and that Albany is starting to actually live within its means, which is the goal we have in our businesses and our households, and it shouldn't be so out of reach for our state government. And this year it wasn't. Albany lived within its means, enacting a budget on those principles. The other thing that's notable about the budget is that in it, as part of the budget process, there are legislative elements built into it. And something very important for many folks in the room, and certainly for us at Empire State Development, were several economic development tools built into the budget. Notably, the Recharge New York program, which is we used to call it Power for Jobs, Senator. For 7 years, that program languished. There were month-to-month extenders. This is discounted electric power used as an economic development tool, especially for large industrial users. It's very, very important for manufacturers in the state. And that program had expired. Again, the budget process reenacted the Recharge New York program. The budget process doubled the Excelsior tax credit program, which is our most significant economic development tool. Excelsior tax credits replaced the Empire Zone program. Amy and her colleagues in our regional office use Excelsior every week in working with companies to either get them to grow in the state or attract businesses to the state. And it went from a 5-year to a 10-year program. Again, part of the budget process. Our small business lending program also was enhanced in the budget process. So there were economic development tools built into that, and not always noticed because the big headline was the headline news of reducing the deficit without raising taxes or any new borrowing. But then after the budget was done, we had a set of legislative accomplishments, again, done with the cooperation of the legislature, working with the governor and his leadership. And these are important, just as by way of review, to recall. The property tax cap, the new ethics bill, a higher education bill, NYS 2020, that positions higher education, especially our SUNY schools and the 3 leading university centers or research centers, as key partners in economic development. A new power plant siting law. Remember this, some of you may recall, we had a law until 2003 in New York State called Article 10, which govern the siting of big generating facilities for electricity, for example. And it expired in 2003, so we went 8 years without a law in New York State to enable the construction of new electrical generation beyond small plants. And so this was also a legislative achievement of note. Why? Because you're taking a law, a provision that existed before, and they gave a certain level of certainty, like the Recharge New York program under NYSERDA, that provides a level of certainty and predictability around energy costs. Is Anthony Campagiorno still here? Because Anthony knows this, and Anthony's colleagues and Steve Land, one of my former bosses at the Business Council, know this issue all too well. If Anthony can't guarantee price certainty to customers, particularly commercial customers of Central Hudson, and those who want long-term contracts for discounted power under the NYPA programs, for example, he can't do economic development. Central Hudson can't support economic growth. If prices are always changing, they can't tell someone from out of state what their electric rate is going to be like, other than that it's going to be high, because by definition, New York State has high energy costs. He can't do his job, we can't do our job. So again, as a legislative achievement, and this gets lost in some of the headlines, right? It's maybe a smaller headline, but this new power plant siting law, we didn't have one since 2003. Having one again provides a framework for the construction of new electrical generation, and that provides for the stability that people in the business community and investors need to see. Again, a government in Albany that understands these key issues, that understands businesses need, even in tough economic times, predictability. You tell me my prices are high, I need to know how high and how long, and how do I plan for my business? So take away some of the mystery, and that was achieved in that's just one example. And I would argue, and the governor has done this forcefully, that another key reform this year was the marriage equality legislation, restoring New York's legacy of progressive leadership, and simply putting New York on a level playing field again in a competitive way with many other states around the country now. These are just several accomplishments, again, legislative accomplishments that came on the heels of the historic budget resolution, right, getting the budget resolved, that all happened very quickly as we think about it now in that 6-month period. First the budget, January through March, and then April, May, June, those 3 months of legislative fury. Albany was very busy this year, and ended in June with those legislative achievements. And I just highlighted some that are fundamental for economic development. And I paused it, why is, some of you were saying, so why is Ken talking so much about these policies? It's because I really believe that in New York State, we focus a lot, especially at Empire State Development, at the agency that I run, on projects. We think about specific projects for companies, for infrastructure. You can think about projects here in Ulster County and in the region. And that's important. But we can only, as an agency, do a certain number of projects a week or a month or a year. It is sort of a retail approach to an economic development in a state as big as New York. It's a $1 trillion economy, 62 counties, 500,000 employers. So we can't just do projects and call that economic development. We have to do policies. And what do the policies do? The policies are aimed at improving the business climate. And that's a wholesale approach. Because when with the legislation and governor work together to pass a property tax cap, think about the implications of that, again, in terms of stability and predictability for employers. And think about the fact that it's not a project, it's a policy that affects everybody. And some will scratch their head over the property tax cap and mandate relief and things that still need to be fixed in terms of mandate relief. And I think that's true. But think of it this way. Just do the math for a second. Based on studies we've done before the enactment of the property tax cap, property taxes in New York State were climbing at a rate of 5.7% per year. That's simply, we looked all across the state at property tax increases, and we did a 5-year rolling average leading up to 2008, which is the best year for which we had data. So you have an average, again, property taxes are local and they change and they're different based on locality, but an average of 5.7%. So now we have, starting next year, this imposition of a 2% cap, or less, right, because it's actually 2% or CPI, whichever is lower. CPI is lower than 2% right now, but just to do the math with me for a second, conservatively, assume 2%. So if we didn't have the property tax cap, and you had a 5.7% increase on average in 2012, and then had that the next at 5%, if the increase stayed the same for 5 years, so 2012, 5 years out, obviously that gets compounded. That's to me the scenario if we did nothing. That's the if we did nothing scenario. Just, let it go. Let that property tax issue, let it go. So you have that 5 point, right? Do 5 years. If you impose the 2% cap, which now we have in law, starting in 2012, and you, again, just do 2%, don't do anything lower like CPI for the next 5 years, the savings is $21 billion. $21 billion. So that's an act of reform, of tax reform for the state, that saves all New York State taxpayers. Businesses pay at least a third of the property taxes in the state. Why I dwell on it for an audience like this, because we also pay it as homeowners. But that's $21 billion that won't be taken by local governments. It'll stay in businesses. It'll stay in homeowners' pockets. It'll stay with New Yorkers for them to spend in this post-recessionary economy. And I know it creates some hardships on the local level for local governments, but that's why policy matters. Reforms at scale affect the whole state's economy and improve the competitive position of the state in energy issues like those I talked about with Anthony, with tax issues like the property tax cap, and with others. So again, the point here is not just the projects that we do, important as each one is one at a time, with an Excelsior tax credit or a NYSERDA energy grant or something else we can do to help a company. It's the policies, really, that affects the tide on which all the boats float. The accomplishments serve as pillars of reform and recovery, and again, I would argue, help to make New York a more desirable location for investment. And we have to have them because we have to have a story to tell to bring new businesses to the state. Each of the legislative achievements will have a profound impact on improving our business climate. Oh, I'm sorry.
Somebody call 911.
Yeah, let's take a break, people. Let's take a break, friends. And
Is there a nurse?